Hello and welcome to the Writing from the Womb podcast. I'm Sama Morningstar and I have Marya Stark with me here today. Thank you so much, Marya, for joining us. I have
Hi.
been getting to know Marya just a little bit here and there by following your work, your musical work, and your musical training work. Working with the voice and songwriting and all of this. And we were also in a writing group together. So I'm so grateful to get to know you a little bit better on the podcast here today. And I would love for you to introduce yourself a little bit more, and we'll go from there.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for having me, Sama. My name's Marya, and I am a singer-songwriter and artist living in Santa Cruz, California, with a background in music therapy and energetic medicine and compassionate communication. And I am currently producing music and teaching online immersions that are steeped in soulcraft and songwriting.
Mm, beautiful. And you have one of these immersions coming up, is that right?
I do. I have an immersion on November 3rd, 7 weeks, and we're doing songwriting as personal alchemy, and we're going to be getting into courting Muse and exploring what is our relationship with Muse and how can we uh, dive into knowing ourselves more deeply through using the creative process as a mirror for our evolution.
Mm. So this is why we're on the Writing from the Womb podcast talking about this, because it sounds like from what we were talking about earlier before we started recording, that this process that you're describing is very similar to what I call writing from the womb, getting in touch with that core creative center in our being that I feel very much resides in the womb space,
Mhm.
and letting that be what we pay attention to and express, and that process by itself of just giving voice to that energy, that what's wanting to be expressed from the womb can be powerfully healing, transformative, alchemical, all these words that I hear you saying. I would love to hear you share more about that. And it sounds like you have quite a bit of training. I'm imagining you have some personal experience with this that inspired you to go get all that training. And so I really love it when practitioners talk about their personal healing journey, that I feel like people can really relate to that, because we can get quite technical once we've gotten some training and things like that. And so getting back to that initial time when you realized, oh my goodness, this is my work, this is what I need to be doing for myself, for my family, for my loved ones, and for the world. And I'd love to hear some of those stories about how you discovered this. When did you start writing? How did you discover its amazing healing powers? What's your, how did you meet the muse, and how did that become so central to your work?
Awesome. Thank you for asking. I love this. Well, I've always been a writer. I loved from the time I was a little kid, I would write short stories and poems, and I got into songwriting. It was just something that was part of how I express myself, and it's very natural. As a teenager, I started writing a lot more. I was starting to experience love and relationship and sexuality, and that all stirred the pot for the muses, for sure, to have an outlet to express emotionally. But when I started studying music therapy, something really shifted for me because I started to discover more about how the mind works and how identity forms, and the power that music has specifically for connecting us to parts of ourselves. So studying that as a songwriter was deeply invigorating, and it started activating this whole other kind of I'm going to say multi-dimensional relationship with writing, because suddenly I had a frame that was looking at everything through the lens of like, this is a mirror for me, you know, like everything is music, everything is vibrating, everything is a mirror of my own mind. So everything now gets to be part of how I get to know myself. And as a writer, to start to dive into like every little movement of consciousness is something that potentially I could find myself mirrored and reflected in was fascinating. And as a young person, I think just negotiating and navigating early childhood trauma and starting to have revelations of myself, of like, oh, what's my family system like, oh, what's my relationship to sexuality, like how did it go well, how did it not go well, like where were the gaps in my learning around rites of passage to feel fully empowered in my body and in my sexuality as a young woman, and why didn't I learn these things? And so as I went through my 20s and started to study energy medicine and just really start to see the deeper layers of where I was holding my, I'm going to say, creative energy like clenched because I was afraid of being hurt, or because I had had those core traumas, and I could start to see like, oh my God, like there's so much life force energy that's shut down and clamped down. To have writing and music as a companion to get to untie the knots that I was holding in my womb and in my creative centers and in my heart and in all parts of me, to have that writing to be this place where I got to open up the basket of my awareness and play with metaphor and play with words that could contain, even if temporarily, the moment of that layer of the unfolding, was a really powerful practice. And I started writing songs that really surprised me because I didn't realize I was carrying so much rage, you know, or like, or bitterness, or like archetypal wounding. You know, it didn't occur to me until I found myself writing about it, because I could sense something was amiss, or something was up, and I was attracted maybe to like these, for example, like darker goddess archetypes. And I'm just like, there's a reason I'm being called to these like dark, velvety red realities. You know, you have all this red behind you. It's just like this obsession and fascination with this frequency range of color. And I'm just like, why is that part? Like, there's some part of me that needs to find itself. And when you started writing as a way to describe in the movie of my mind what I was seeing, it was all coming through image and sensation, and it didn't feel personal until I got to reflect with it, like, oh, like who is the who is the wild this wild woman with fangs who's like bitten off, you know, the head of the giant, like what is she talking about? And really getting to understand, like, oh, these are the things that I've been storing inside of my consciousness as I've grown up in the cultural trance of what the belief systems are supposed to be, and what my natural spirit wanted to break through and outgrow and evolve beyond. So in that way, writing became this outlet. It became a process of discovery. It became a doorway for what I call muse, is like creative spark, but also like muse as parts of myself that were leading me to reconnect and become more whole. And they were showing me the pathway through these images and through these poems and concepts. And then I could follow these paths towards these parts of myself that were like, thank you, now we're ready to come home to you. So it's like soul retrieval through songwriting, and spontaneous availability to channel things that were outside of my conscious awareness, but became part of who I know myself to be now.
Wow, there's so much in what you just shared. You mentioned at the beginning of what you were sharing that it sounded like you were saying there were rites of passage that were missed. And I that sprang up for me, alongside what you were also sharing about trauma. being
Mhm.
traumatized growing up.
Mhm.
And so we've got these rites of passage that are missed. Probably that alone is traumatizing, because we really need these passages, especially womb-centered passages like birth, coming of age, various milestones in our upbringing, in our childhood, before we actually start menstruating, right? And then, of course, menarche and first menstruation, and then other rites of passage along the way that are powerful moments of transformation that are happening, and then to have those be unrecognized and unnourished,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Undernourished or unnourished, completely ignored, dismissed, um, clinicalized, if that's a word.
Mhm.
Making it seem like it's just this clinical, biological thing, separate and devoid from any kind of emotional or spiritual development, somehow separating that out. And these are the belief systems of the, what did you call it? The societal trance, did you
Yeah,
say?
cultural trend.
Cultural trance, where that says these things aren't important, right? And so that alone is traumatizing. But often on top of that, lack of initiation and rites of passage, on top of that is ongoing and sometimes even acute. In fact, more often than is imaginable. That we would be in this place, that there's acute traumas, especially around sexuality, especially around the female form, in this cultural trance that says it's okay to exploit that, the female body. And
Mhm.
so these traumas and this lack of rites of passage and this cultural trance, what I heard you say, there were things that you stored inside that didn't have permission, that didn't have space to be expressed,
Mhm.
that then when they emerge, and like, especially when you said you didn't realize you had so much rage and bitterness, these are feelings and emotions that don't fit in the cultural trance, that we don't have permission to experience, especially as womb bearers, as female gendered
Mhm.
people. uh, don't have permission to experience and especially not express that the allowable, sanctioned way that we're supposed to be in that cultural trance is devoid of those kinds of feelings. And so that woman you describe with the fangs that's biting off the head of the giant, that has something to say, our imagination, what I'm hearing you talk about is the muse and the imagination filling in those gaps, providing healing pathways for those traumas, and unearthing, bringing back to the surface these aspects of ourself. And you talked about soul retrieval, for those who aren't familiar with that kind of terminology in certain traditions. It's very common to see the soul as having been fragmented by these kinds of traumas, or having not been completed by missing these important rites of passages. There's parts of us that we didn't get fully activated, right? Parts of our soul. And so this soul retrieval says, let's go back and revisit that rite of passage and activate that part of our soul. Or let's go back and retrieve the parts of us that got fragmented away from our soul, or hidden away, or tucked away under the subconscious during a traumatic experience, or series of traumatic experiences. And so what I'm hearing you saying is that the writing is a way to, by itself, without having to do any kind of special ceremony, although we can, right? Do special ceremony around writing. And I'm imagining your program is going to involve some of that. But that, I didn't know how to have special ceremony with my writing, except until somebody gave me a beautiful journal that was so beautiful, that just sitting down with the journal in my hands and opening it up, the imagery itself of that, and the book, feeling the book, can become a ceremony in and of itself. And then the writing process itself allows for that, and it's so powerful. And I would love for you, because and then you're taking it another step further with the music being this companion as well as the writing. You're talking about them as though the writing and the music are actual entities and friends when you talk about it as a companion. And so
Yeah.
I'd love to hear you say more about that, how writing becomes a companion, how music becomes a companion and participates in this soul retrieval journey, and particularly around how you guide people to that in your teaching, in your workshops.
Thank you for that beautiful, yeah, framing and recap. And I I love to explore, like I'm a big Rumi fan, right? And we think about the divine. We can name the divine in many names. And one of the names that I've come to know the divine through is this name of the Muse. And I love the name of the Muse as another name for the divine or the beloved God. Muse. They have different qualities. I think they evoke different parts of reverence in me, but they're all sitting inside of the same pool of resource and love. And so when I can think the Muse, and I think about the Muse as an aspect of divine co-creation and this quality of creative energy that is in us and it is all around us. So it's that, and we're a part of it, and it exists outside of us and inside of us and with us. So there's this aspect of creative energy that I see, like we can have multiple relationships to it. First person relationship, I thou relationship, all is a relationship, which for me is like one of the frames of the divine. It's like it's in me, it's in the other, it's in all of us, it's all around. So when I think of music as an expression of, and writing as an expression of this co-creative force, this divine muse energy, it contains all of the same seeds for me too. So if I can relate when I choose to go to the practice of writing as a transformational practice, as a practice of like hanging out with the beloved, hanging out with God, hanging out with my soul, then I get to have all of those relationships. I get to have, this is me in the seed of the creation. This is me and life force in the creation together in collaboration. This is all of life conspiring to create forward through the vessel that I am. And in framing all three of those things and hanging out in the different ways that they evoke different qualities of self-knowledge and autonomy and sovereignty and confidence and reunion, has been a really healing practice for me. It's helped me to locate the place in me that has to create as a part of being a part and fully living with divine essence. It's just like it's such a healing um, way, and in that way I call it the companion. It's a companion that's always with me and that comes from me and moves through me and sometimes arises outside of me as a mirror to remind me of how connected I am to beauty. And so inside of this workshop, we're going to be playing with these for, it's like, how do we relate to that experience of being in the vesselship, in the space where we enter into this powerful thing that happens where something comes from nothing, where something inside of us that has been kinetic energy, potential energy starts to manifest outside and to be in the actual potency of the stream of it happening in the moment. And how when we bring extra attention to that, it's very precious. And I think that it can be very healing for the parts of us that can sometimes be cut off from the majesty of a life. And when I think about trauma and the real impact that trauma can have, at least for me, is this sense of being disconnected from the holy, disconnected from the body, disconnected from meaning and purpose and belonging to the co-creative force of all that is. And so when I have come to approach creativity as a sanctuary for healing trauma, that tends to be what starts to bubble up. It's like, oh my gosh, like this is the part of me that forgot, like, oh, this is the part of me that has been, hanging out in this portal of time that's still unclear about exactly what happened, and where a part of me didn't feel safe anymore to be have fully arrived and be fully present. I start to go into the sanctuary of calling all of myself to myself so I can be available. And those are the voices and the parts that start to come home. And so when I guide workshops, we're just playing inside of different doors to consciousness. We're just, it's like, what's another doorway that we can connect to soul? What's a doorway that we can connect with creative energy? And the beauty, I think, of creative process is that there's no right or wrong way to do it. There's no, like, from a healing perspective, there's different stages of development. There's different ways to go about refining and mastering the craft. And we'll look at all of that. But as a healing modality and as a practice of transformation, it's all about the process. It's all about exploring ourselves in every stage of the process. So it really doesn't even matter what we come up with. It doesn't matter what the outcome it is at all. It's really about who did we get to see ourselves as inside of the process, and what did we learn from that, and can we hold extra attention around that so we can really inform our base consciousness and those parts of ourselves that, like, this too is okay, like part of who I am, and this too is welcome in the spectrum of being human and multidimensional and, like, fully faceted. Like, even when I was resisting creativity, even when I didn't like what I created, even when I said the truth that I didn't want to say, even when I surprised myself with beauty, like, all of these are actually important parts of the journey.
It's beautiful. What I'm hearing you share about is there's a way that we separate from ourselves, where we talked about before, that we become fragmented, the soul becomes fragmented. We separate from life, all that is. We separate from our experience of the divine somehow, and that trauma has something to do with that feeling of separateness. And when you spoke earlier about the womb space being clenched up, that creative center in the body being clenched up, and I talk a lot about in my work of the biomystical aspects of the womb space in the body, that our biology can be a map of what's happening for us mystically in our experience of spirit and the divine. And so if the body is clenched up, then that's often how we feel in the spirit world, is clenched up or even just disconnected altogether. And that when we feel fully connected to the divine, there's often this sense of real expansiveness. And so what I'm hearing you talk about is how this connection with the muse and with all of these voices in us can help us to find that expansiveness and that connectedness to all things in all these different ways that we might relate, whether we're expressing to another being, whether and relating to another being as the divine, whether we are relating to ourselves as the divine, or whether we're relating to all that is of the divine. In all these ways, we're just expanding and open to connecting, and being and feeling more and more connected. And that the writing and the music creation process alone, regardless of whatever result that we might have as a song that we've written or whatever, just that process of opening to that voice, opening to that creativity, starts to weave that connectivity for us, and that expansion for us, and that unclenching and that reclamation. And I want to get a little technical with you, because I also practice vocal sound healing as a central part in the womb, in the healing work that I do with the womb. And I often explain to people from sort of a more scientific perspective, because in the biology of it, because it helps people to ground and see, oh, this is what's happening. This is why I feel so good when I sing or when I vocalize. This is why it feels so good when I write. And so what what I'd love to hear your reflections on is this process in, in trauma recovery, which often when we have unresolved trauma, what it shows up as in our body is a tendency to be in fight and flight mode still all the time. Mm-hmm. In our nervous system, which mm-hmm. produces certain stress hormones in the body too much and too often and for too long, and then that becomes detrimental to our biology, to our organs and tissues. Those stress hormones are meant to be short-lived, right? That's how we're designed. And so how do we recover from that becomes a really important question. And what we're talking about here is how the writing process, not only of writing words, but also music to go with the words, because you're talking specifically about song writing, which not only are you opening the portal for the imagination to bring words and for the muse, for us to be inspired for words to come, but we're also opening the imagination to bring sound, nonverbal sound, musical sound. Mm-hmm. And that's such a, whether you're singing or whether you're playing an instrument, it's this full body involvement in mm-hmm. songwriting. And there's this auditory imagination as well as a verbal imagination that's activated. And so when I talk about this, I mean, I know I can tell you what it does when we actually vocalize and sing, not necessarily even singing any particular notes, but just vocalizing, toning, chanting in the body. It has a very profound effect in that trauma recovery process of bringing us out of fight and flight mode and neutralizing the stress hormones, right? Mm-hmm. But this process of imagining and letting the muse have her way with us, can you share how that has those similar, it seems to me like it does from my own personal experience, have that same, even before I even sing the song, even just imagining what the song, hearing the song come through me, feeling the words that are arising to meet the feelings that I'm having, becoming aware of the feelings that I'm having inside, the lost parts of me that are coming home, and then putting a word to that or a series of words. Just that alone feels like I'm just getting tingles talking about it. And that's how we know some like biological something is happening, right? So maybe you can share the technicalities of how that process or whatever you feel to share about that.
Yeah. Another like aspects of the work that I do is Voice of My Womb, which is a whole body of work, or we're using song and voice to reconnect to the womb and give the womb a space to emerge, and all of the vocal cord resonance work. So voice is definitely a huge aspect of regulation, self-regulation of it's like one of the best ways to regulate our nervous system. It's one of the fastest ways to do it too. Deep breathing and toning, and so like you said, yeah, the healing that it can take place to decrease stress in the short term and the long term. But even more than that, what tends to happen is that when we experience trauma, especially as young children, we start to pop out of our body. We start to train ourselves, because as young children, we don't know how to regulate our nervous systems yet. So something traumatic happens to a little kid and they just freak out, you know, screaming and crying and shaking. And it's so healthy because their full breath is involved. They're vibrating all their organs. They're actually letting out the shock from all of their organs. And at right around 6, 7 years old, this other adaptation starts to come on when we're starting to really recognize our place in social elements, like a whole other level of self-awareness and consciousness comes on. Because they say at 7 the soul fully incarnates into the body, and so we're present to a whole different kind of awareness. And at that time also children recognize that they can stop themselves from crying by controlling their breath. And so what will start to happen as a 7-year-old is when we start to experience trauma and we don't have safe places or emotionally literate spaces to fully unpack the happen, or if the adults in the field aren't tracking what's going on because they're, you know, have 30 kids in a classroom and the parents aren't with their kids all day because they're at a job, you know, and so this is just a different situation. We're not like somatically woven with the children in a school setting where they're like having safe people they can even physically be in co-regulation with on a regular basis, right? It's like we're living in a really different kind of social structure with how we raise children. And so now children are having to like track, okay, who are the adults in this space? How can I fit in so that I'm causing the least amount of disruption and get my needs met for safety and love and survival and like be good and get the great, you know, like, and then just like, so how am I fitting into the social situation? So it's a lot of complexity for a little kid to process. And so one of the ways we do that is by controlling our breath and teaching ourselves to breathe shallowly. So we start to adopt a whole breath process that creates naturally a disconnect from the lower half of our body so that we don't have to feel as intensely when something shocking or charged occurs, because we don't have the safety and the social structure to be able to hold us through a full somatic release of that. So kids are then start to just like form these tighter breathing patterns. So singing, for people who, like, I was lucky, I was singing my whole life, you know, and so I always had a connection to my lower pelvic floor and my diaphragm. And so even and singing for me in throughout my childhood and like a lot of times will be a place, if I'm feeling tense and wound up and I start singing, I'll start just going into cathartic crying. Like I won't be able to stop it, because I'm breathing into my pelvic floor, I'm breathing in my diaphragm, I'm vibrating my organs. You know, when you vibrate your organs, they start releasing. It's amazing, right? It's very healthy. But for a lot of people, if they're not in a regular singing practice, they're not an athletic singer necessarily or doing it every day, they're not going to have the same kind of relationship to their breath and relationship to vibrating through their whole system. So part of the healing that, and it still happens for me too, like part of the healing, I think, for a lot of women who start to take on, like, who crave, like so many women that I know, they crave like, oh God, I want to sing, I want my voice, I want to have access to my body in this way and to the bliss that happens when I'm singing, but it's so hard because my voice is trapped. And so much of the violations that happen with the womb space have profoundly to do with our voice and our ability to say, to have clear boundaries or clear emotional understanding of dynamics that start happening. And so many times if a boundary has been violated, we don't know it even, you know, it's like it's just happened, and now we're in a space of trying to negotiate, like, how do I hang out with in-group fields where boundaries are being violated? Do I have too big of boundaries now? Do I not have enough boundaries? And all of that stuff starts coming up. And then the voice is so intimately connected with the strategies that we develop to protect ourselves from feeling it all. So singing becomes a way to start to vibrate our central channel, to actively engage our pelvic floor, to actively engage our diaphragmatic breathing, and bring in literally more spirit, more inspiration, more life force, oxygen, oxygenate the blood into our system. We're vibrating our belly, vibrating our womb, vibrating our cervix, like singing into these other parts of ourselves. And it's really intimate because now it contains the imprint of all of our unhealed trauma and all of our desire. Like our soul can be heard in our voice, which is really, it makes the human voice so beautiful because we can hear everything that is going on in a human person with through the signature of their voice. And it also makes it very vulnerable. So if people are like shy about sharing their voice, it's like, because we know instinctively that like you're gonna hear the places where I'm not sure about myself. You're gonna hear where I don't love myself. You're gonna hear where I'm confused. And it's all just imprinted, you know, and it's all subconscious. And it's in the it's a beautiful, I think it's beautiful that way. It's like very naked, you know, it's like, it's literally something that's coming from inside of us outside. I think it's one of the most naked things we can do besides just being naked in front of each other and making love. It's like communing with a group of people with my voice. Like it's this, I feel it can have the same level of communion and intimacy. And so working that in a healing container can I think help us to regain a sense of confidence, connection to these intimate places when not ourselves. It can help us reclaim our voice, reclaim the voice of our womb, reclaim the voice of like, oh, these, start to understand, oh, this is why I'm contracted here. Oh, this is why it's been always hard for me to say what I want. Because these were the times that I wasn't listened to, or these were the times that I was told I was being selfish, or these were the times that like no one heard me and I didn't know how to, or I didn't have the words or the language. And this comes back to rites of passage. You know, we don't have these rites of passage to reinforce and nourish these stages of our lives and see like, yes, you did childhood and these are the things that came from it and these are the things I see you, and now we can like graduate into this adulthood. We're still carrying these unseen parts of our maiden into our adulthood, and parts of us are still in child. You know, that's the detriment to not having these rites of passage being held in the village, by the cultures. We're all just still little children trying to figure it out and not totally in our bodies. So bless us, you know, bless it. Like, and I speak about this fully from my own experience, and continue as I continue to reclaim parts of my child and parts of my maiden, and those parts of myself, through through the devotional act of singing as a way to get in my body and as a way to access the truth of what I desire and the truth of who I know myself to be, and to actually use the voice to clear the womb. And once we clear the womb, what then does the womb have space to dream? You know, it's like, I love the vision of, if we're holding on to the unmourned longings of our lives and of our ancestry, it's hard to dream the new future. It's really hard to it's hard to see into a future timeline that is pregnant with possibility of beyond what we haven't yet let go of, or what we haven't yet mourned. And this, and again, becomes a place where writing and I think this is one of the most amazing things about the arts. Any art, writing, dancing, myth making, storytelling, is it gives us a space to tell the story of what happened. As dark and weird and twisted or glorious as it was, it has a space to be witnessed and heard. And now that we can clear that and make space for something new, what's beyond that?
Yeah, it's
What
so
else is
important.
possible?
Yeah, what's healthy and what's possible. You know, when you talk about, especially this last part, you know, makes me see more clearly the importance of, you know, I've been writing this book. We were in that Birth Your Book workshop together, and I've been working on this book, and it just, more stories like farther back. It's, my book is it has a memoir component to it, and I keep going farther back through the ancestral generations and telling stories that were held in secrecy, that no one told me, but that my imagination, my womb space is able to access through that ancestral lineage. and even through my imagination, I don't even know if these things actually happened or not, but they're coming through me as stories, like you say, that never got witnessed, that never got told, that never got acknowledged. And it's almost like there's parts of me that are threads connected to those stories that need those stories to be told and shared uh, with everyone. And so it's so beautiful that you share about that, that this storytelling, a lot of spiritual practices talk about, even insist to let go of the story.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that might be at a certain point in our development an important thing to have happen. But if we're trying to do that before we've witnessed and grieved
Mm-hmm.
the story completely, before we've allowed ourselves to fully process, then that just sustains that dissociative disconnection from ourselves and doesn't allow that full reintegration that often needs to happen. And I just, I just keep going more and more into these stories that were, held in secrecy and shame, and especially these womb stories of mothers and children and babies and birthing, and what it was like to be a menstruating woman through these lifetimes when there was so much shame and all of that held in ourselves and passed down to us. And it feels like we have to go back so many generations to even process all of that. And that as womb-centered healing practitioners and artists and therapeutic artists, even that it just feels like the magnitude of the stories that we need to tell and sing about has to match the magnitude of suppression and pain that we're carrying. And so your giant fanged woman who's biting off the head of the giant is making more and more sense to me as we speak. And I'm so glad I get to meet her, because it meets the magnitude of what we're all here to process and grieve, of what's been going on in our society for the past number of generations, for very long time, and what we're at a crisis point of finding, facing ourselves as a species and coming to a new place. And so I would love to hear you talk about the role of the creative process and this healing process that we can do as individuals through writing and music, and how that translates to activism in our world. And I'm not necessarily talking about just one type of activism that we typically think of when we hear the word activism, of going out and protesting, or like that there's so much more types of activism. I see art and the creative processes as a powerful avenue for activism. And so I'm curious what you might have to say about that, about this rich, deep self-reclamation process, and how, and then for you, I mean, professionally, you're taking that to then share that with other people, and that's activism in and of itself. And then how can we uh, I mean, at a certain point, we just have to trust that that's going to ripple out into the world. But then, can we activate that in some way to really be participating, especially in a society and in a cultural trance that devalues or invalidates artistic expression as something that's, it sort of only values like other kinds of expression as something that will even make a difference for anything. I mean, we all know. I mean, we can't live without music. I mean, I need to turn on music sometimes to even just be able to function in the day, right? So we need that music. And so please reframe that thinking about activism and making a difference and contributing to this great evolutionary shift that we're all feeling right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, I love what you positioned when you were talking about like the difference between transcending the story
Mm.
and like going deeply into it as different stages of a whole process of healing. And that like one of my favorite techniques is actually a technique I learned from compassionate communication school, which is, what am I telling myself? You know, it's not just like transcend the story. It's like transcend and include, right? Like the transcendence doesn't happen until we include and understand and integrate, right? Like you said, it's just like we have to actually de- de- decompress how that story arose, especially, you know, because our ego structure is basically formed of all these little stories and habits and nervous system habits and muscle memory habits based on the stories we tell about ourselves. And so if we have a societal body that has certain stories that it's telling itself and certain habits of form that are adaptations of those narratives, one of the most powerful acts of activism, I think, to unhook ourselves from narratives that are not life-giving, um, that are that are you know, that are not taking us closer to soul, and not and are taking us further away from being connected to, you know, the creative force in a way that's fulfilling. You know, we know that that's possible because I think we're all chasing it. I think everyone's chasing that at some level, or has a haunt of it somewhere, or is like it's part of this the human spirit. And so when we have these cultural narratives that come into play that are a result of unprocessed trauma, and a result of strategies for survival and power and accumulation and all of these things, on, it's a huge source of activism to decompress those, where those live within ourselves. Like, wow, you know, like, why am I behaving in this way? What are the values underneath that are hanging out there? We start to dismantle the ecosystems and the infrastructures that have been acquired. They're part of acquired identity, but they're not who we are. You know, it's what we learned. And so if we are to take action towards the dream of a society where all can thrive, we have to understand the stories that are not in agreement with that, and how they play into our own consciousness, and how they motivate our own behaviors, and how they are like acting upon us. And I think that telling the stories of the unmourned secret holdings of our ancestors is a part of that. It's not the whole thing, because if we stay there, you know, it's a drag. Like, as someone who's done plenty of that, it's not the only thing I want to do, right? It's
I
definitely
had to take a break. Like my book was like going deeper and deeper into this ancestral journey. I'm like, no. Okay, I'm writing a basic herbal workbook. Okay, so I like stopped that and jumped forward to now and said, all right, we're doing a workbook. These herbs are good for this very practical thing. We're gonna do, you know.
I think it's titration, right? Like, you know, and
Yeah.
to use a term of trauma recovery, it's like, how do we get to a resourced state and then go a little bit into the trauma, just so the system can process and integrate what it can, and then go back to a resourced state. We don't have to, like, you know, go to be in full catharsis all the time in order to make progress.
Right.
Um,
Oh, thank goodness. Well, oh my goodness, we could probably go on and on about all of this, and this is a wonderful place to sort of encapsulate what we're talking about, because the this work of working with the Muse and the writing and the music, I feel like, and it seems like you might too, feel that this, when we do write as a way in creative writing, and especially songwriting where the music is part of it, that titration is sort of built in, because we're creating something that is a resource. Like we're creating the resource at the same time as working with that story. And so it's a different way of being with that story that is creating something new and healing at the same time as connecting with it. So for example, in writing my book, as I'm diving into those stories, I'm weaving healing into those stories. And I'm actually becoming the guardian angel of my ancestors, if you will, because I have resources that they didn't have. And so I'm bringing that to them. And I've had that experience of being my own guardian angel or resource at times in my life when I didn't have resources. And those are oftentimes the traumatizing moments, is when there's no one to help. There's no way out. And then that's when people usually find themselves on their knees in prayer. And that's when there's often this experience of some spiritual being there to support you, or we might imagine it, or we might think we're imagining it, but that's often the kind of resource we find when there's no other resource available. And we can become that resource for ourselves in that. And so the storytelling itself can become this healing thing. And it seems like music, just imagining, and that's what I was kind of referring to earlier, just imagining the music that accompanies these words and and imagining and allowing the poetic way of saying the story to arise, is bringing these resources to whatever that difficult story might be. So the story of the fanged woman biting the head off even though that's like this gnarly, intense, rageful thing, it's also very healing, because she's like conquering that giant, and so there can be that kind of resourcing that happens within the creative process. Like we dream up our own medicine in that creative process. And so I just want to thank you for illustrating that and speaking to all of that and weaving these beautiful reflections together. And I'd love to invite you, if you have any closing thoughts on all of this, and also to share about how people can get in touch with you and learn more about your upcoming workshop.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I love that to wrap it up. I think it's that thing, that coming back to this relationship with the divine and the muse and the holy and the sacred. And it's like, and in being in co-creation with it, it's like, oh wow, when I'm like traumatized and now I'm calling forth resource, and now I'm back in co-creation with something that's allowing for the thing that happened to be dramatized, to be more, and then to transform. Right, like, because it doesn't stay there. It's like we're giving it, we're like feeding it what it needs to sing its song so that it can move on, and then it transforms into something else. And that's what I love about, again, it's just that, like, I come back to this faith that the creative energies that be are conspiring in our favor when we go to the altar of co-creation with them towards that which is like part of the movement forward of destiny and of creative, like the direction that it's headed. And when we lack that trust or faith, because we have all this evidence that that's not how it is, it's hard to co-create. It's hard to create anything when we don't trust the direction. So I love going to, and that's when we need to tell our stories, so we can say, this is why I don't trust the direction of life moving forward towards beauty. and then it gets to say the thing, and then something else usually happens.
Mhm.
Like, because now we're in the channel, and when we're in the channel, miracles happen.
Mhm.
So I just love that part of it.
Mhm.
And I can't wait to dive into all of this madness and magic in Courting the Muse, 7 weeks of songwriting as alchemy, which starts November 3rd. And then, yeah, ongoingly next year, we'll be doing a Voice of My Womb work, which will probably be like 13 weeks, but based in womb stories and rites of passage as well.
Mm. Beautiful. And so where can folks get in touch with you about this?
People can come to my website, rosebardacademy.com, or my music website, marya-stark.com, Maryastark, and there's a dash in the center for the website. So either website will take you to the portals of where these things are happening.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. And listeners know that if you want to learn more about the Womb-Centered Healing Temple and the Biomystical Womb Apprenticeship that's starting October 31st, you can go to wombcenteredhealing.com. Thank you so much for joining us today, Marya. Sending big hugs for our state. I'm in Northern California too, so hugging you from close by, actually, relatively, and prayers for rain as well soon. We're hoping our wonderful rain will come. So thank you so much again. That's all for now. Until next time.